Alright guys, today we're going to be reacting to Asian Americans are overachievers. Then this is why. Thomas Sowell, let's jump in.
What about Asian Americans who often seem to, as a group, perform better in school than other groups? Why is that?
I think the one four-letter word we can't use is work. And they just work. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at UCLA and I had to go on a Saturday night to the research library. And as I looked around, almost everybody I saw was Asian American. I looked in vain for any black students there, not many white students there. So the following week when I go to class and I find the Asian Americans better prepared, there's no real mystery to it to me. They work.
You say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't. A study was done in San Francisco schools to show Asians, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and how they score in various fields, in mathematics in particular. And there were vast differences, for example, between the Asians and blacks in terms of how many got high math grades. What struck me was that for both the Asians and the Africans, the number of hours that you spent working or doing homework in math was almost identical with the same percentage who got high grades in math. Wow. So that whether you're black or Chinese, if you spend an awful lot of time on the math, you're going to be doing better than the person who's not.
And I think that has to come with culture. Or you might have to just really change some of those bad behaviors. I include myself. Now that I go back, I could have done better. But now I'm here, and I know I still can do better. So that's a good point. And if I was, in my teenagers years, if I knew some of this stuff, because my guidance was very poor in some of the academic areas. So if I was ahead in some of those things and just prepare myself better, make sure that I study, become, a more rounded student, maybe I could have a different lifestyle. However, now that I'm older, I can understand this. The advantage is I can be better knowing the formula.
Well, there were great disparities. The disparities were differences in how much time you spent on math homework.
Well, then conversely, Dr. Sowell, are you not saying that groups who do not overachieve are groups who don't work hard enough?
Sometimes, but sometimes the government itself makes it impossible or very difficult for groups to work hard enough. The minimum wage law is one classic example. Occupational licensing laws are another. Insofar as the school system fails, those groups that don't have an independent educational tradition are lost. Whereas if you have that independent tradition, even if you go to a bad school, if the parents can help you, if you get the maximum that you possibly can from the books and so on, you still may achieve quite a lot.
Yep.
So it's a combination. It is the culture, but at the same time, insofar as the society puts barriers, particularly the government, which has tremendous power, and supplies education and other kinds of things, insofar as they do that, they make it tougher for you to do it.
Well, do you suspect that you may be guilty of de-emphasizing the effects of racism in that pattern?
There's always, everything is a possibility. But as I look at the data, I don't find any correlation between the degree of racism and the degree to which groups advance.
That means you have to do the same argument for Asians and Jewish. And it seems that data is not representing that, or it's not showing that. So that argument in itself is just invalid.
As if you look at the history of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the hostility they have encountered there will compare with any hostility blacks have encountered here. There have been a number of occasions in the history of Southeast Asia where the number of Chinese killed in a few days exceeded all the blacks lynched in the history of the United States. So they are enormously hated.
What about Jews?
The Jews, of course, the same thing has happened with the Jews numerous times. Thousands killed here, thousands killed there. And of course, under the Nazis, millions killed. The groups, incidentally, which have suffered the most violence, and I use that as one index of group hostility or racism, those groups have typically been middleman minorities. The Chinese, the Jews, the Armenians, the Igbos in Nigeria, 30,000 of those were killed in massacres just within our time. And yet I don't find any correlation in the long run between the economics and the political hostility.
All right, let's get back to the primary criticism of your book made by a writer I really respect, William Raspberry, syndicated columnist. He says that you make these points, but you don't say what we should do.
What we should first of all do is understand what does and does not work. I don't consider myself to be a policymaker, despite what the media may try to say. I consider myself to be someone who tries to supply facts so that those who do make policy will know what they're talking.
He's basically the one that provides the information, and then we have to simply just provide the solution. He's not the solution maker.
About, as they usually do not.
Now, speaking of what the media says, you have stopped giving interviews for the last couple of years.
Yes, I should have stopped many years before that, actually.
Why do you say that?
I see no correlation between what I say and what the media reports. One of the most hideous things that I've seen reported was on the CBS Morning News, where they said or suggested that I was a believer in the theory of genetic inferiority of blacks. Now, I have been arguing against that theory for more than 10 years, and I don't know how many books, how many articles, and how many lectures. This was so well known that British television tried to arrange a debate between Arthur Jensen and me. I don't know why the word got to London, but it never got to Washington.
So you have been wary, to say the least, of the media.
I think that's an understatement.
Let me quote to you again, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, quote, "Without the cultural prerequisites for developing natural resources into real wealth, the raw physical resources themselves are of little or no value," close quote. Tell us what you mean by cultural prerequisites.
Partly, that would be simply the knowledge of how to use things. As I mentioned in the book, the main difference between us and the caveman is simply human capital. Don't forget the caveman had all the natural resources we have today, and he had them in greater abundance because none of them had ever been used up. But he didn't have the knowledge that it would take to turn those to his own purposes.
We just know more.
Yeah.
We just know more. Now, you note a certain productive capacity that certain cultural groups demonstrate. And you can see them because they demonstrate the same, let's call it industriousness, as they disperse to different parts of the world.
Yes.
Germans, Chinese, Lebanese, Jews, Indians, quote, "The productivity is a matter of culture. That productivity is a matter of culture is shown."
I agree with that because even Germany, when they moved to the South and West Africa, they created a nice area. They brought their culture, they brought their lifestyle, and they built a nation in that region. Even in Brazil, heck, even Argentina, United States, Australia, everywhere that they go, the Germans, the Chinese, they built. They're always building. They have a strong culture, and that's what we're missing in some of these groups.
Shown by how many groups have arrived in various countries far poorer than the existing population and have nevertheless risen above the economic level of those who were there before them. Close quote. Let's just choose, you name a lot of groups, it's a big book. Let me just toss one at you and see how you do. The overseas Chinese.
Oh my goodness, the overseas Chinese settled largely in Southeast Asia. Many of them came there with little more than the clothes on their backs. There was one Chinese millionaire in one of the countries who had in the foyer to his mansion this stick with a little cloth thing tied to it, because he walked into this place with that stick, all his belongings, and this little cloth thing tied to his stick over his shoulder, and he took off from there.
Wow.
All right. The Jews.
Oh my heavens, that's been in so many places. My gosh, the Lower East Side of New York, one of the most terrible places when the Jews landed. The poverty and
that area, they have gentrified that area so much. If you guys being in the lowest south part of the Brooklyn, my goodness, Lord, these Jews, they have transformed that area to something that you can't even fathom. It's like something from like a Manhattan in that area. It's insane. Jews have something. The Jews have something that we are We're trying to say they're smarter than everybody. No, they have a culture. They respect the culture. They're trying to keep the culture together. And they go from there. And we don't want to admit that, but that's how they do it.
A squalor is just unbelievable. In fact, even as late as the late 1940s, when I went to school on the Lower East Side, I had always heard that all Jews were rich. And when I saw the Lower East Side, I said, why are these rich people living like this? The buildings on the Lower East Side were older and in worse conditions than the buildings in Harlem where I lived.
And they don't live there anymore?
No.
Those neighborhoods have turned over?
Yes. And it went by generation. The generation that was there first, even when they rose up to where they could have moved, they didn't, because many of them were not fluent in English and so on. And so you could live on the Lower East Side knowing only Yiddish, right, and find doctors, lawyers, anything you wanted, go into stores and so forth. And if you moved up to upscale places like Harlem, which was once Jewish, or to the Bronx, which at another time which became Jewish, you would lose that. The more acculturated people, the next generation who spoke English and were more familiar with American society, they lived in those kinds of places.
Got it. So why is it that in many instances that you detail, you get a subgroup, the Chinese move to Fiji, and why is it then that so often we see the pattern that the indigenous, the people who were there first, fail to get with the program? And to the contrary, not only do they not get with the program, learning the skills of productivity, they tend again and again and again to persecute the groups that came with nothing but achieve a certain level of affluence. So we have the Jews, that's an old story, ancient story, the persecution of the Jews. But you also show it with the overseas Chinese in Malaysia, with Indians in East Africa, and on it goes. What's going on there?
Well, for one thing, there's no particular reason to have expected the indigenous people to have acquired the same skills that the people who came there had. And worse yet, the leaders of these groups are very quick to blame the fact that they are lagging on the other groups.
Or the white people in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Look at South Africa. Once in a while, once in the 90s, they were a great economy, a very large economy in Africa. All of a sudden, the native African, they wanted, they got into power, and there we are. They want to, delete them and all that stuff. It gets crazy, folks. And I don't know what it is that we don't want to be honest about this conversation. And if we are honest, but we are afraid of what persecutions are going to be after that opinion. Truth is truth. If we know the truth, we should be okay. It's okay to just talk about this. And this is where Thomas Sowell comes handy.
We're more advanced. One of the phrases that you often hear, that this group took over this whole industry. And in many cases, there was no such industry until they came there and built it. Right. They did not take it over.
Right. So those are examples of the way culture can promote or enable economic productivity. You also provide a counterexample, the Soviet Union. Quote, the Soviet Union was almost a tailor-made refutation of geographic determinism. Explain that.
Oh, the Soviet Union was one of the most richly supplied countries with natural resources, and probably the most richly supplied. It was the only industrial nation which has so much petroleum that they export oil.
Right.
They have some, I don't remember the fraction, but they have a substantial part of the world's supply of natural gas, which they're now supplying all over Europe. Iron ore, manganese, you name it, they had it. At one time, something like half the industrial diamonds in the world came from the Soviet Union.
Wow.
The land was so rich that when Hitler sent his army in to invade the Soviet Union during World War II, he had plans to have the railroads take back this land from Russia into Germany, because it was that well known for its
You mean just the topsoil? He was going to send boxcars of topsoil back to Germany?
That's right.
I didn't know
Wow.
that.
It's one of the most fertile sections of and the irony is one of the world's great famines occurred in the Soviet Union.
How come?
Mismanagement by the government. Milton Friedman once said that if the government took over the Sahara Desert, there would be a shortage of sand.
Milton Friedman, he was a huge believer of the free market. If the government took care of the desert, there will be no sand. I agree with him. The government is so bad at managing money. They're so bad at it.
And the Soviet Union, it was just that way.
All right. More on social factors. I'm quoting again from Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. This is tricky ground. There is empirical evidence against genetic determinism. We're talking about IQ scores now.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there have been whole communities of whites from isolated mountain regions in America whose average IQs have been similar to or lower than the average IQs of black Americans. But while such evidence undermines genetic determinism, that does not make mental test differences irrelevant. So we're not genetically determined, but disparities among ethnic and racial groups are still worth noting, still consequential. How do we put this?
No, you're seldom hiring a whole group or admitting a whole group to college. What you're doing is judging individuals. And the predictive validity is really a totally separate question from the question of genetics versus environment. See, in other words, if the IQ test does not have a single question about flying an airplane, and you give it to people who want to become pilots, the only real question is, do the scores on those tests correlate with the subsequent performance of people in the air?
Right.
And you know what's crazy?
I mean,
in his case, it's true because in his upbringing, you can tell, high school dropout, ran out of the house, living in the streets, went to the army, and boom, now he's just a very disciplined guy. So culture has a lot of outcome on him. So, influence his outcome, I would say.
Sounds so simple when you say it that way, but the Supreme Court of the United States had a totally different take, that the employer must validate a test that is not job related. And so what they're saying is, it's a question of whether this test seems plausible to third parties who have neither expertise nor experience on the job. And that will be the criterion for whether it's a good test.
All right.
Very good. Very good. Love that. Love that. Shout out to Thomas Sowell. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I'll see you in the next one.